Hey, it's Ye for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you 5 tips to correct any tension problems you might have in continental knitting. So, since I published my video on continental knitting and why I like to use it, I have been getting several people asking questions about tension and how to correct or get better tension in continental style knitting. Now, some of the tips I'm going to show you can also apply to any other style of knitting, or at least most other styles of knitting. But in this particular video, I'm focusing on the continental style because that was what was asked. So I'm going to show you 5 different methods or tips or tricks that you can use to correct any tension problems with this style. So if you've watched my continental knitting video, then you know that continental style knitting just means that you hold the yarn in the left hand instead of in the right. And I like to use this method because it is more efficient. I am not very fast at all at English style knitting, which holds the yarn in the right hand. So I much prefer the continental style for knitting, mainly because it feels very natural to me since I learned to crochet before I learned to knit, and I've always, for crochet, held the yarn in my left hand. So this is a general example of what even consistent tension should look like. I'm not saying my tension is perfect, because it's probably not totally perfect, but you just want all your stitches to look consistent. All the stitches should be about the same size, and there shouldn't be like any major gaps or anything between your stitches. Unless you're using a really thin yarn with a giant needle or something, then you shouldn't be able to like see through your fabric with these big gaps in between the stitches. So if your knitting is too tight, I'm gonna like make my yarn really tight here. If your knitting is too tight, it can be very difficult to insert the right needle into the stitch, and it can cause you to kind of have to force the needle into those stitches if they're that tight. And it can also cause your stitches to have a hard time sliding across the needle if they're really tight, because they are, hugging the needle so tightly that it has a hard time moving across the needle. So if you have any kind of problem like that, that's how you know your tension is too tight. If your tension is too loose, then you might have a really easy time dropping stitches. The stitches might slide way too easily across the needle, and you might have gaps in the knitting. Not from skipped or dropped stitches, but just empty spaces because of loose stitches. And you also might have a hard time grabbing the yarn. So let's say my tension is loose and I have like kind of some slack in the yarn. It might make it harder to grab the yarn because it's too floppy and too loosely tensioned. So we want to create an even, consistent tension, and one of the biggest things you can do to correct any problems like that is, number 1, to change how you're tensioning your yarn, or how you're letting the yarn run through your fingers. So the way we wrap the yarn through our fingers it plays a huge role in controlling our tension. And since every knitter is different, some people knit looser and some people knit tighter, some people knit somewhere in between. But since every knitter is different, there are multitudes of different ways to run the yarn through the fingers of your left hand to put the correct amount of tension on it for you. So I will say in advance, there is no wrong way to put the tension on your yarn as long as it is coming over the top of your index finger to the knitting. Otherwise, you can wrap it any way you want into the fingers of your hand to get the tension you need from the yarn running through the left hand. But there are several most commonly used ways to do this. Some of these are maybe not quite so common, but I'm going to show you several different ways that you can hold the yarn in your knitting, or in your left hand while you're knitting. And then you can kind of see which one you might like, and figure out which one is going to work best for you, or maybe even a variation on one of these will work best for you. So first of all, every time we wrap the yarn around one of our fingers like this, that adds tension to the yarn. So for example, if I wrap the yarn around every finger on my hand, that adds so much tension on the yarn that it can't glide through my hand because that makes it too tight. So the important thing is that the yarn is gliding smoothly through your hand. Now, if you are a loose knitter, and even if you already have the yarn wrapped around one of your fingers, if you're still a loose knitter, you might need to wrap it around another finger to add more tension to your knitting. If you are a tight knitter and you have it wrapped around one of your fingers, you might need to try a different way of holding the yarn that doesn't wrap the yarn around any of your fingers. So the first hold I'm going to show you is probably one of the more common ones. I've got my hand palm facing up. I'm going to wrap the yarn around my pinky, up behind my index finger, and then the yarn runs over my index finger to the knitting like so. So the yarn is wrapping around the pinky and then up behind the index finger so that it comes over top of the index finger to the knitting. This way does not work ideally for me, so I use a different method, but this is one of the commonly used holds for continental knitting tension. Another one is to wrap the yarn around the index finger twice, like so, and that puts all the tension wrapped around the index finger. I personally don't use this method either because for me it's too much tension and I don't like my finger being squeezed as the yarn feeds through. But if it works for you, then that is the important thing. So you might need to try out several of these to see which one works best for you, and if you might need to modify one to make it work. But this is also a relatively commonly used hold for continental knitting. Another hold that you may or may not have seen for continental knitting, this is ideal for tight knitters because this will automatically loosen your knitting because it is a looser tension method, is the wrist wrap. And this uses the wrist as a tension area for the yarn. So there are multiple ways you can do this, but I'm going to show you two different ways. I've got my left hand, the back side of my hand facing up, the palm facing down. I'm going to bring the yarn away from me towards the outside of my hand, across the back of my hand like this, then under my pinky like so, and over the top of my index finger. So then my yarn is being fed behind the pinky finger and around my wrist, and that puts tension on the yarn, but that puts less tension on the yarn. So if you're a tight knitter, that one might work well for you. I've also seen it done where if the left hand is facing down like this, the yarn wraps towards you around the wrist, back behind your hand, and then back towards you over the top of the index finger like so, where it's not going in between any of the fingers, it's just going around your wrist and then over the back of your hand. This is also ideal for tight knitters because it is a looser tension method. Both of these methods with the wrist wrap are too loose for me. So if you need to modify any of the tension methods or come up with your own even to get just the right amount of tension for you, then that is totally fine. I personally use the same tensioning method that I use for crochet because it just felt very natural to me, and this is the tension method that works best for me. I like to hold my hand face up or palm up and weave the yarn under and over my fingers like so. So it's going over the pinky, under the next finger, over the next finger, and then behind the index finger so that when I turn my hand up to hold the needle, it's coming over the top of my index finger like so. And for me, this is my favorite method to tension the yarn. And I like it because it does not wrap the yarn around any of the fingers. So It's not too much tension for me. It doesn't squeeze my fingers if the yarn starts to get caught or anything. And also, I can kind of have like micro control over the tension. If there is any particular place where I feel in my hand, because when you're tensioning the yarn in your hand, you feel how much tension is put on the yarn. If I feel that a particular stitch or combination of stitches or whatever needs a tiny bit more tension, I can close my fingers together a little bit more to slightly tighten the tension. If I feel like the yarn needs to be a tiny bit looser for a particular stitch or technique, then I can open my fingers up just a little more to allow the yarn to feed through just a tiny bit faster. So that's why I like that method, because not only is it most comfortable for me, it produces the best tension with the way that I knit, but it also allows me like super tiny amounts of control over making particular stitches or combinations of stitches tighter or looser. So that is my favorite way to hold the yarn and tension it while knitting Continental style. But like I said, you need to figure out whichever way is going to work best for you, even if it means testing out a bunch of different methods to find what works best. So tip number 2, this is kind of more for people who knit loosely. What happens with Continental knitting is this yarn comes over the top of the index finger. And sometimes, especially if it's new to you, some people hold their index finger up like this. Now, first of all, this is not as natural for the hand to be in this position for a long period of time. But when you're holding the index finger up straight, you have more of a tendency to kind of slightly move it as you're knitting, because you don't keep it perfectly straight the entire time. And so consequently, let's say I'm holding my finger like this, and then I start to my finger starts to kind of relax, then this yarn starts to droop. So if I was holding it like this and my finger relaxes even just a little bit, it droops like that, and there's too much slack in that. And so then that can create loose stitches, because you're putting slack into that tensioned area of yarn, and that can make it harder to grab the yarn since it is looser and it doesn't have the tension on it that it should. It's got slack in that section of yarn. So it's important, not only for tension but also for efficiency, to keep the index finger relatively close to the left needle. So I generally keep my index finger right about here. It's maybe 1/2 inch to 3/4 away from the very tip of the needle, and about 1 inch away from the needle at right where it starts to taper, or right where my first stitch is sitting. So if you're keeping the index finger closer to the needle, that is a more natural position for that finger to be in. And because it is not only in its natural position, but it's also going kind of in the same direction that the rest of the fingers are going, that can help with your finger not moving around so much, because it is in a natural position and less likely to want to move. Besides the fact that when you're up here, there's more room in the yarn. The yarn has more length in it for your finger to move back and forth in it. But when your finger's down here, the tension that's in the rest of your hand kind of limits how much you can deviate from where you started, the exact position in where you started. So keeping that index finger close to the needles is really a good idea, especially if you're trying to go for efficiency, but that can also help your tension if you are having problems with loose knitting or having a hard time grabbing the yarn because it's got too much slack in it. So tip number 3 is to change the type of needles you're using. So needles of different materials have different amounts of surface friction on them because they're made of different types of material. So bamboo has probably the most friction of any needle that I've tried. And if you're a tighter knitter, bamboo needles can tend to make the stitches tighter and slide more slowly because they have that friction on the surface. So because they slide more slowly, then that can make it harder if you're a tight knitter, if those stitches are really snug around the needle. Since there's more friction on the surface, that can make it harder to scoot stitches across, and also possibly harder to insert needles into the stitch because you're not only a tight knitter, but your stitches are hugging that needle because it's grippy. It's got a lot of friction on it. So if you're a looser knitter, bamboo might actually work really well for you because that extra friction can help keep loose stitches on the needle. And if your stitches are loose, you might want to give bamboo a try because that extra grip will help the stitches stay where you put them without just sliding off whenever they feel like it, so to speak. So slicker materials for knitting needles, such as these, which are nickel plated, they can have very, very little surface friction. So that allows the stitches to glide pretty quickly and smoothly across the surface. And if you were a looser knitter, a slick needle might make it harder to keep from dropping the stitches because the stitches are already loose and they're on a slick surface, so there's not enough surface friction on the needle to keep the stitches still. So that might cause needles to fall off if you are a loose knitter. Now, if you're a tighter knitter, a slick needle might help to correct your tension as well, because if you find yourself forcing the needles in and out of the stitches, it might be because your high friction needles, such as bamboo, do not allow your stitches to move easily because they're so tight, and that can make it harder to get the needle into the stitch. So a slick needle is going to be better for tighter knitters, while a higher friction needle will be generally better for looser knitters. Now, there are other types of needles on the market, other types of materials that you can get. These right here are aluminum, and these are, believe it or not a slick needle. These are slightly less grippy than bamboo. They have a little bit less friction than bamboo, but they are still not as slick as some other materials. Nickel plated is so far the slickest type of needle that I have ever tried, but my personal favorite is laminated birch. And for me, laminated birch has just the right amount of friction on it. These right here, these short circular needles, are also laminated birch. And it's a layered wood, and it has a coating on it of some sort, some kind of finish coating. And it has just the right amount of tension for me, where that I can knit quickly and I can scoot the stitches along easily, but it still has just enough friction on there to hold the stitches on the needle. Now, I have kind of average tension, but once you have tried out several different types of materials, and once you have found the best tensioning method that works for you, you might be able to use any kind of needle you want and still get pretty decent tension. But you might, if you have a major tension problem right now, it might be a good idea to try a different type of needle, because that can help your hands get a feel for, if you're a tight knitter, get a feel for loosening the tension a little bit. And if you're a loose knitter, it can help you tighten your tension a little bit. So I really like the speed of laminated birch and the extra speed of nickel plated, but I could still use bamboo if I wanted to and not have any tension problems from it. I just can't knit as fast because the stitches don't slide as quickly. So tip number 4, believe it or not, the yarn itself can also cause tension problems. And it's not the actual yarn that can cause the problem. It has more to do with how the yarn is wound. So if the yarn is wound into a ball that you've hand wound yourself, then if you're not using a yarn bowl or some kind of container to keep it in one place, then as that ball rolls around the floor, it can tend to feed very unevenly from the ball. So for the most even feeding of the yarn, I highly recommend using the center pole end of the skein if it's a store-bought skein, like this one. This one has an end of the yarn that wraps around the outside of the skein. and this end of the yarn pulls out of the center, and this center pull end is going to feed more smoothly. It's not going to be like absolutely perfectly smooth, but it's going to feed more smoothly than the end that wraps around the outside of the skein. So if you are using a hank yarn that comes in a hank like this, where it's just a big long loop of yarn that's just twisted together and you're supposed to wind it yourself, then I highly recommend, if you are having problems with this, to get an inexpensive yarn swift and ball winder. I have some very inexpensive ones and I use them all the time. They're not like super awesome quality. They're not going to be as good as like a wooden swift that costs 4 times as much, but they still do the job pretty well, and I really like them for turning these hanks of yarn into center pull skeins. Now, obviously, this one did not come off my yarn ball winder. This is a store-bought one, but this is what we call a cake of yarn, where it is flat on both sides, and it can sit like that on the table, on the floor, whatever, and it just feeds out of the center of the skein right from the top. And so this type of skein does not roll all over the place like a hand-wound ball does. And this is the very same type of skein that you would get if you were to wind your yarn that comes from a hank on a yarn ball winder with a yarn swift. So if you're having problems with your tension being uneven, it might be because of your yarn. And if you're using hand-wound balls of yarn, or if you're using the outside strand of one of these skeins, then that could be the cause of uneven tension. So I highly recommend using a center pull skein of yarn whenever possible. And if the yarn that you have does not come in center pull skeins, then I suggest getting a yarn winder and winding it into a center pull skein. So tip number 5, this one is not quite as common, but it can still happen. And this is something for people who knit tighter. If you are working the stitches in the wrong place on the needle, then that can make tension problems in the knitting. So with Continental Knitting, it is most efficient to keep the stitches close to the needle tips as you're working them. But if you're working through your stitches down here on this tapered section of the needle tip, then that can cause the stitches to be too tight. And that's because the stitches are supposed to fit comfortably around the circumference of the straight part of the needle. And if you're working your stitches down here on the tapered tip, and that is all that your stitches are getting to the right size on, then the tapered tip is much narrower than the rest of the needle. So by the time you slide them onto the straight part of the needle, they're too tight. So this is why we knit our stitches down past the tapered end when we get to the straighter part of the needle. So on this particular needle, the tapered part isn't that long, but I have seen it longer on some needles depending on how thick they are. So we are supposed to be knitting close to the tips, but not so close that we're down here on this little skinny part. So I want to keep the first stitch of my row right past that tapered section of the needle tip. And then as I start to knit, it's still very comfortable to keep the stitches kind of close to the tips, but not so close that they are getting their size from the very smallest part of the needle instead of the straight part of the needle. So by the time the stitch gets across to the right needle, it should be on that straight part. So if you're having tension problems with Continental Knitting, I suggest the first thing you do is change how you're wrapping the yarn through your fingers. Secondly, once you've found a way of wrapping the yarn that works for you, try changing what type of needle you're working on. And then, like I said, if you're a loose knitter, try keeping the index finger closer to the needles. And if you're a tight knitter, try making sure that your stitches are not being knit on the very, very ends of the tapered parts of the needle. And if you have uneven tension, then just make sure that your yarn is feeding smoothly from the skein. So I hope these tips have been helpful to you. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you try one of these tips, let me know how it works for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.